law is that you ought to act in accord with the legal system of your community, right? And that's it is part of natural law that there are human laws, right? Because all human communities need laws in order to function and allow people to flourish. You can't just have people taking justice into their own hands. It's a good question. Okay, so we never intentionally harm an innocent person. Another form of this, right, is we never treat a person as a means to an end, right? We never treat a person as a means to an end. Every human person deserves to be treated as an end, as a goal in their own right. Another way of putting that is you always treat a person as a who, not as a what. Right? So once you start treating people as objects, things have gone wrong. Right? So this is, when we talk about using someone or objectifying someone, that would be kind of a similar.
Okay, we use the term home invasion.
Okay.
And how does natural law, church ethics feel about a family member using force to when somebody breaks into their home? What is the thought on how much force should we use to hold back a home invasion?
Well, natural law, Catholic ethics has always affirmed the right to self-defense. It includes the defense of other innocent people that you are responsible for. So that has never been, there's always been some people within the church who have argued for or practiced pacifism.
Right.
Which is certainly has a long history in the church. And for, in certain situations, I think it can be a kind of powerful witness to the hope of the gospel. I don't think it is necessarily appropriate for society as a whole, and it's certainly not required by Catholic teaching. What Catholic teaching would say is you ought to use the minimum force necessary to prevent the attack or the injustice. Right? So now, one of the other principles of Catholic ethics is you're only ever morally responsible for you. Little Elmer Fudd moment there. You're only ever morally responsible for what you can reasonably be expected to know and to do. Right? So in the heat of a exceptionally tense moment, right? No one could expect you to sit there and calculate, well, what's the minimum force I could use to successfully, right? You can use a reasonable force. Now look, if it's a home invasion by, a largely incapacitated toddler, right? Obviously you can use much less force than you would on, an angry cop gone bad, right? And there can be cases where you use excessive force, right? But
it sounds murky.
Well, there's always a difficulty, right?
Yeah.
This is one of the challenges in ethics, right? Is the church has many very clear ethical principles, right? Usually, so when people talk about all these gray areas, there are some questions that are really unresolved in Catholic teaching. So I do graduate ethics. So one of the main ones that my class this last semester really got all worked up about was the idea of embryo adoption, right? We have all of these abandoned embryos at in vitro fertilization facilities. There are some very pious, loving people who want to give these children a chance for life and are willing to adopt these embryos, right? It's not clear yet where the church is ultimately going to come down on this issue. There are some documents that say we really ought not to do that, but they are certainly not the final word. right? There's still debate, even among ethicists very committed to the church's teaching. So there are a few issues where most of the real challenge in ethics comes with how do we prudentially apply these principles to complex real-world situations, right? So the principles of self-defense are very clear. You do the best you can to apply them in the situation as you find yourself, right? So if you are in a situation where you can carefully plan out what you're going to do, you have a higher responsibility to follow those principles clearly. If you are forced in the heat of a moment to make a split-second decision, you do the best you can to follow the principles. And you can't be, right, we see this in our legal system too, right, that there's a difference. If you walk in and find somebody that seems like they are attacking your family, and you react violently, and it turns out you were mistaken, you're going to be treated differently than somebody who held a grudge against somebody and coldly and calculatingly planned an attack against this person and then didn't. Right, so that we recognize that distinction. All right, so it's all rooted in this belief in the dignity of the human person, that we never are going to intentionally violate a person. And we're going to recognize all human life from conception to natural death as being a person, right? And this is going to be one of the key ways that Catholic ethics differs from a lot of other views in our society, right, where they would say you have to have a certain ability or a certain functionality to be considered a person, right? So personhood does not depend on consciousness or rationality or any other criteria you can think of except for simply being a living human being. Right now, does the church claim to know absolutely the details of what brain death means in terms of the soul, or do we know exactly how a soul comes to exist in that initial cell of the human person? No, right? But we would say the fact that we don't know exactly how some of those details works is kind of beside the point. We're going to treat all human life as a person from the moment of conception to a natural death.
What about execution?
That is an interesting topic. So capital punishment traditionally has been seen as not violating this because it's not an innocent person. That they now there's a couple of different ways of taking that, right? One would be in some situations, particularly historically, it has not been feasible to safely and humanely incarcerate someone who is a danger to others, right? So if you have a violent homicidal maniac and you're living in, 12th century Paris, it's going to be really difficult to keep that person safely incarcerated in a way that isn't like throwing them in a dark cell in a dungeon and never letting them out. Right? So historically, capital punishment has been used as a type of defense of society from particularly violent people. There's also an argument that would say that a person can lose this innocence having committed certain horrible crimes, and so that we can execute them because they are no longer innocent in this sense. That is a issue that has been hotly debated in recent decades within the church. So if you look at the statements of, I don't know if Paul VI addressed this or not, but at least since John Paul II, all of the popes have basically argued that we ought to only use capital punishment in cases where it is the only way to safely defend others from a person. And so that means basically in the modern developed world, we ought not to use capital punishment because in 21st century America, there are ways to keep somebody incarcerated incarcerated humanely. That's a whole other issue about our penal system, maybe for another day, but we could do it so that we ought not to use the death penalty. We might come back to that one later on. So,
I was just gonna add that something else that kind of muddies that issue a little bit is convicted doesn't always mean not innocent, because we do convict.
Yes.
Because of our system and our flawed system, sometimes we convict wrongly innocent people, so if
Yeah.
we are putting innocent people to death, then we are violating.
yeah, and so that becomes, that is part of the Catholic argument against the use of capital punishment, is that there are those situations. So I do want to make sure we hit some of these principles of Catholic social teaching here before we run out of time and have to all turn on our, I don't know, you guys probably all have devices you can watch the Chiefs on. I actually, last year I was giving a presentation at Newman on Ex Cordia Ecclesiae, this church document about Catholic universities. So you know, it's one of these like professional development things that people are forced to go to. So they're all really excited. So I'm standing up there. And this was the day of WSU's Elite 8 game, I think. Right? And it was going on, like, so I walk into the room and the game is on like the jumbo screen. And I'm like, haha, right? So, and the provost is like, oh, don't worry, it'll be over in a minute. Like, no, it was not. So then, I'm like, well, I guess I just won't do it. She's like, well, we really need to get this done. So I gave my presentation, right, as like literally next to me, on like a 20-foot screen by whatever, like WSU, the last 5 minutes of their game was going on. Yeah, that was spectacular. So my wife was joking, like, oh, I'm going to run up against the Chiefs game. And she's like, well, maybe you could put it on behind you. That'd be awesome. I'm going to never let the provost live that one down. So I did want to just real quickly, because it will, it is important in lots of ethical situations. We're not going to do it all like we did last month or whatever that was, but I just did want to remind you of double effect, and for those who weren't here before, just to spell out the basics, because we will have to refer to it as we go along. Right, so there are lots of situations in Catholic ethics where we are faced with a choice, and where none of our choices seems to give us only good outcomes. Right, there are lots of cases where it seems like if I do this and to get this good outcome, I'm also going to have this bad effect that comes along with it. Right, so that's where we use this principle of double effect. Right, now I will explain this. Some of you might think this looks like some kind of shady shenanigans going on here. So I will say that this actually goes back, you can find the roots of this in Aquinas's writing in the Summa, right? So this is not something that crafty Catholic theologians have come up with to get out of sticky situations. It does go all the way back. So in double effect, there's kind of 4 criteria, right? And so the first is my class from last time. You remember this because you just spent days ruminating on your notes, I'm sure, right?
Well, you ran well out of class.
Yeah, there's that. So the act itself must not be immoral. Right? So this is the key thing, because a lot of times when people see double effect, they think it's the same thing as what a lot of people in our society do, kind of utilitarianism, that you're just picking what gives you the best mix of outcomes, right? But this is the key step to say, no, that's not what we are doing, right? Because if the act itself is immoral, it doesn't matter how good the outcome might be, you can't do it, right? So if I could cure every chronic disease that plagues mankind, but I have to intentionally kill this one innocent child, I can't do it, right? Even though the consequences are stupendous, I cannot carry out an act that is itself immoral, like the intentional killing of an innocent person. It doesn't matter what you're going to do, what the consequences are going to be. Adultery is never going to be approved by principle of double effect. So if the act itself is immoral, that's the end of the discussion. So if you have, though, if you meet this, the act itself isn't immoral, right? So then 2 and 3 I often mix up the order. So
Intention must be for the good.
yeah, so the intention is for the good, right? So you have to actually be trying to get the good effect. You can't get bad effects by kind of twisting this thing around. So this comes up a lot with contraception, for example, right? That there are some ethical medical procedures you can go through that have the unintended consequence of eliminating fertility. Those can be morally chosen, but you can't really want to get the sterilization and then use the medical goal as like an excuse for sneaking the sterilization in through the back door, right? So you have to actually intend the good. Number 3 is you can't, my handwriting is getting worse, can't get the good through the bad. So you can't get your good effects through the bad effects. So for example, at the end of life, when you are giving more pain drugs to a patient, you can't get the pain relief through the death of the patient. Right? Now you can give pain medications that are going to increase the chance that this patient will die sooner, right? So there are some pain medications that are going to have an effect of suppressing respiration, right? But there can be situations where you could still morally give that drug because it's necessary for pain control in this situation, right? But you can't give that drug intending to actually cause the death, which is how you're going to get that person out of pain, right? And then lastly is the good must be commensurate to the bad, right? And this is the one where people, when they see it, they're like, oh, well, we're just utilitarians, right? No, right? You only get to weighing the outcomes after you've met all these other criteria, right? So once you go through all of that, then you ought to act in a way that is going to give you the best good outcomes and the fewest bad outcomes. All right, so any clarification questions? Or?
Well, even on number 4, the question of the good may be debatable.
But yeah, this is a guide for thinking through situations. It's going to be difficult. So for example, right, there are some situations. Sorry?
Like feudal care.
Yeah. When does care become burdensome or disproportionate? That is something that there is going to be real debate on in real life situations. Or, you know, for example, there are situations where people could use artificial hormones, which is basically the pill, to treat other medical conditions, right? When does that become appropriate, right? Does a pesky case of acne sufficient good, the treatment of that, to outweigh the evil of the contraceptive effect? Perhaps not. Maybe it's a case that's so severe it's completely debilitating to this person socially, or maybe they have some other serious hormonal problem that's causing lots of suffering, in which case maybe the good does equal the bad. There are going to be many cases where it's difficult, right, that people could have genuine disagreements about the balance of the good and bad effects. And that's certainly going to be the case when we look at Catholic social teaching, right? When we think about economic policies or things like that, weighing the good and bads is going to be a place where a lot of the debate is going to happen.
Who came up with this list?
It developed over the centuries through lots of theologians working on it. Like I said, if you look at Aquinas, the roots of it are going to be there. But he wouldn't have had this list. And sometimes the list looks a little different, but these are the basic principles you're going to find. There's not a lot of debate on these. The debate comes with when you go to apply them. to situations. Other questions? Okay, so that's our refresher in Catholic ethics. So what we want to look at, focus on moving forward through the rest of the semester is Catholic social teaching. And so what is Catholic social teaching? Right, well really, what Catholic social teaching is thinking about how do we apply, live out these principles within institutions and organizations, right? So it's one thing for us to talk about a particular patient's choice of how to deal with a particular diagnosis or problem, right? Catholic social teaching is looking more at our entire healthcare system, or when we look at, well, what's the moral choice for a person to make in terms of balancing their family and job expectations, right? That could be an ethical issue to work through individually, but on a societal level, we can also talk about how should we, as a society, balance an emphasis on family versus an emphasis on business or the economy or things like that. Right? The other, another way of thinking about this is, again, last time we talked about the principle of legitimate cooperation, right? Which was, way of thinking about how much responsibility do we have for the moral behavior of organizations that we are a part of, right? So how much responsibility do you have as a customer of Walmart for the way that Walmart treats its employees, or the way that Walmart sources its products from maybe sources that are destroying